They said it was the perfect marriage. Smiling photos, quiet dinners, no public fights. From the outside, everything looked calm, almost boring. But behind closed doors, something far more dangerous was taking shape. This is not a story about sudden rage or a crime of passion. This is a story about patience, about control so subtle it went unnoticed, about a mind that didn't need to raise its voice to destroy lives. Because the most terrifying killers don't strike in the dark, they pull the strings in plain sight. At first, no one suspected a thing. Not the neighbors, not the friends, not even the person closest to the truth. The manipulation was slow, deliberate, and almost invisible. Words were chosen carefully. Emotions were redirected. Doubts were planted like seeds, left to grow on their own. What looked like coincidence was actually design. What felt like free choice was carefully engineered. By the time the truth began to surface, the damage was already irreversible. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the real weapon isn't a knife or a gun, it's influence, the ability to bend others without them realizing they're being bent. Psychologists call it coercive control. Victims call it confusion. Investigators later called it one of the most calculated crimes they had ever seen. Every move had a purpose. Every reaction was anticipated, and every person involved played a role, whether they knew it or not. Tonight, we're unraveling a murder where the killer rarely got their hands dirty, a case where innocence was an illusion, love was a tool, and trust became the deadliest weakness of all. As we pull back the layers, one question will haunt everything you're about to hear. How do you escape a trap when you don't even know you're inside one? The call came in quietly, almost casually. No panic, no screaming, just a husband doing what any concerned spouse would do. He told the dispatcher he hadn't heard from his wife in hours, said it was unusual, said he was worried. His voice was steady, cooperative, calm, the kind of calm that immediately builds trust. From the very first seconds, the narrative was set. A loving husband, fearful that something might be wrong. Police logged the time, early afternoon. A routine welfare check. No signs of urgency, no red flags. Officers have responded to thousands of these calls. Missed phones, locked doors, misunderstandings. Most end with embarrassment and relief. This one, at least on paper, looked no different. The husband stayed on the line, offering helpful details. Where she might be, her habits, her schedule. Every answer fit perfectly, too perfectly. When officers arrived at the house, nothing appeared disturbed. The door wasn't forced. The neighborhood was quiet. Inside, the home felt lived in, normal, almost staged in its normalcy. Family photos, clean floors, no signs of struggle. The husband arrived shortly after, visibly anxious but composed. He paced. He asked questions. He thanked the officers. He played the role flawlessly. Concern without chaos, fear without hysteria. Then they found her. The shift was instant. What began as a routine check became a sealed crime scene. Radios crackled. More units arrived. The husband's worry turned to shock, at least on the surface. Tears came later. Controlled. Timed. He told officers he couldn't understand how this could have happened. He repeated the same phrase again and again. I just wanted to make sure she was okay. And that sentence, simple, harmless, would become the foundation of the lie. Because the welfare check wasn't an act of fear, it was an act of timing. Every minute mattered, every step was calculated. By placing the call himself, he positioned his concern on record. He framed the discovery. He became the man who tried to help, not the man who needed explaining. Long before investigators began asking hard questions, he had already decided how the story would start. What no one realized in that moment was this: the crime didn't begin with the call. The call was the final move in a plan that had been unfolding long before anyone thought to look. The garage was the last place anyone expected to look, and the first place that shattered every illusion. It was quiet. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, just a closed space that felt wrong the moment officers stepped inside. The air was heavy, still, almost staged in its silence. This wasn't chaos left behind in a hurry. This was control. She was found where no one should ever be found, lifeless, positioned in a way that felt deliberate. The brutality wasn't loud or explosive, it was methodical. Injuries told a story of force without frenzy, no signs of a desperate fight, no evidence of panic. Everything about the scene suggested compliance, or at least the absence of resistance. That alone unsettled investigators more than visible violence ever could. There were no obvious weapons nearby, no blood-soaked tools, no frantic attempt to clean. Instead, there was an eerie neatness, as if the garage had been chosen precisely because it offered privacy, isolation, and time. This wasn't a crime committed in anger. It was a crime committed with patience. Each detail whispered the same message. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every inch. Tire marks, footprints, the positioning of the body, even the temperature of the room mattered. The lack of disorder became a clue in itself. In crimes of passion, scenes explode with evidence. Here, the evidence was restrained, controlled, almost respectful, until you remembered a life had been taken. Outside, the house remained untouched. Inside, the garage held the truth everyone wanted to avoid. Investigators began to understand they weren't dealing with a break-in, a random attack, or an accident gone wrong. This was personal, intimate, the kind of violence that requires proximity and trust. And that's where the shock truly settled in, because the brutality of the scene wasn't just in what had been done, but in how carefully it had been concealed within normal life. The garage wasn't a place of rage. It was a place of execution, a private stage where the final act had already played out long before police arrived. By the time the crime scene tape went up, one thing was clear. The calm they had walked into earlier wasn't innocence. It was the aftermath. And whoever had orchestrated this had already left, not in a panic, but with the confidence of someone who believed the story would hold. In the days that followed, fear needed a face, and the husband was ready to provide one. He told investigators his wife had been scared for weeks, that she'd mentioned someone watching her, a stranger, a presence that didn't belong. The details were vague, but emotionally charged. Late-night anxiety, uneasy glances, a sense of being followed. It was the kind of story that instantly shifts suspicion outward, away from the home, away from the marriage. Friends confirmed pieces of it. Yes, she'd seemed stressed. Yes, she'd mentioned feeling uncomfortable. But those fragments were enough. The husband filled in the gaps, carefully, never too much. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He just worried. He suggested. He wondered out loud. And in doing so, he built the perfect villain, an invisible stalker who couldn't defend themselves. Police took it seriously. They had to. Patrols increased. Doorbell footage was reviewed. Phone records were checked for unknown numbers. The community grew tense. Women locked their doors earlier. Neighbors watched each other longer than usual. Fear spread fast, and fear is powerful. It doesn't need proof, just possibility. The husband leaned into that fear without ever appearing to push it. He spoke softly in interviews. His grief looked genuine. His concern felt protective, not strategic. He repeated how guilty he felt for not taking her fears seriously enough. It was a subtle reversal, from suspect to remorseful protector. A man haunted by what he missed, not by what he did. Behind closed doors, the story evolved. Each retelling sharpened the threat. The stalker became more persistent. The signs became clearer, in hindsight. The manipulation wasn't loud, it was emotional. He mirrored the fears of others, validated them, let them grow on their own. When people are already scared, they don't question the source of the story. They cling to it. Investigators followed the trail, but the stalker never solidified into a real person. No consistent sightings, no matching vehicle, no digital footprint that held up under scrutiny. The fear existed, but the villain didn't. And slowly, that absence began to speak louder than any accusation. What made the story so effective was its simplicity. A faceless threat, a random evil, something no one could predict or prevent. It explained everything without demanding answers. And for a time, it worked. Suspicion stayed external. The husband remained central, but as a victim. But lies built on emotion have a weakness. They depend on consistency, and the more the husband spoke, the more his concerns started to feel rehearsed. Details shifted, timelines blurred. What once felt like organic fear began to sound like a script struggling to stay intact. The stalker was the perfect villain, until investigators realized the real danger had never been outside the house. It had been standing right there, helping them search. If emotion built the lie, data would destroy it. While the public focused on the stalker story, investigators turned quietly to something far less dramatic, but far more reliable. Phones don't feel fear, computers don't forget, and unlike people, digital evidence doesn't grieve, panic, or protect anyone. The husband had been cooperative from the start. He handed over devices willingly, phones, tablets, laptops. He believed the narrative he created would survive scrutiny. After all, he hadn't done anything online, at least nothing obvious. That confidence would become his first mistake. Forensic analysts began with timelines, call logs, app usage, location data. Every movement of a device leaves a shadow, and those shadows don't lie. They noticed something subtle at first. Gaps. Periods where the husband claimed to be asleep or away, but his phone was active, not messaging, watching, checking, waiting, activity without purpose, unless you knew what to look for. Then came the searches, not frantic, not impulsive, methodical. Terms related to surveillance, deleting data, body decomposition timelines, how long before a death is detectable, how phones track location, even when turned off. These weren't the searches of a grieving man trying to understand tragedy. They were the searches of someone preparing for consequences. Investigators dug deeper. Messages that had been deleted, but not erased. Drafts that were never sent. Notes written and rewritten. The husband had been documenting conversations with his wife, reframing arguments, saving moments that could later be twisted into evidence of fear or instability. He wasn't remembering, he was curating. Location data delivered the blow that cracked the case open. The husband's phone placed him in the garage at a time he claimed he was nowhere near the house. Even more damaging, it showed prolonged stillness. Not passing through, not a quick stop. Time spent in one place, long enough to contradict every version of his story. When confronted, he hesitated, not in confusion, but calculation. Digital forensics also dismantled the stalker narrative piece by piece. Anonymous numbers, traced back to apps installed on his own phone. Suspicious messages, drafted, saved, and deleted by him. Even browser activity showed him researching how to create the illusion of harassment without leaving a trail. The villain he described had been digitally manufactured. What stunned investigators wasn't just the evidence, but the planning. This wasn't a spontaneous cover-up. It was a performance designed for multiple audiences: police, family, media. Each layer of the lie had a digital counterpart meant to support it, except he underestimated the depth of modern forensic tools. The turning point came during a second interview. Investigators stopped asking emotional questions. They laid out timestamps, coordinates, data points. No accusations, just facts. The husband's posture changed. The calm he had worn so comfortably began to crack. Silence replaced storytelling. For the first time, he had no narrative ready. In that room, the puppet master lost control. The technology he believed he could outsmart became the voice that spoke when he could not. Every click, every pause, every deleted file testified against him. The invisible strings he pulled so carefully were suddenly visible to everyone. And with the digital mask stripped away, investigators finally saw him clearly, not as a grieving husband, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of the crime itself. The morning began like any other, at least to an outsider. Sunshine streamed through the blinds, coffee brewed in the kitchen, birds called outside the window. But inside, the calm was a carefully maintained illusion. Every movement had been rehearsed, every word had been calculated. The day had been planned down to the minute. What followed would turn ordinary domestic life into a scene of unimaginable horror. Forensic investigators later reconstructed the timeline, piecing together devices, security cameras, and witness statements. The husband's movements were meticulous: breakfast prepared, dishes washed, a brief exchange with his wife, ordinary and affectionate on the surface. But behind those gestures, a predator was already at work. He watched, waited, and measured. The fear he would later claim to feel hadn't existed yet, not in him anyway. Only patience, calculation, and cold resolve. The garage, the hidden stage of the crime, was prepped in advance. Items subtly rearranged, surfaces cleared, every object positioned to prevent detection, every detail intended to obscure the brutality that was about to unfold. Investigators noted that nothing was left to chance. The act itself, when it came, would be swift, controlled, and absolute. There would be no chaos, no last-minute panic, no accidental mistakes. Only the deliberate orchestration of a life-ending plan. As the hours passed, the interactions between husband and wife remained normal to anyone who might see them. Conversation flowed naturally, laughter even. But forensic evidence later revealed tiny disruptions in the expected rhythm of her day, delays, pauses, a misplaced item. These subtle signs were invisible to her, unnoticed in real time, but they marked the moments when the predator's plan was quietly taking shape. Every action was intended to lull, to maintain trust, to prevent suspicion until the very end. And then came the final moments. The timeline shows her last independent movements. A routine task, a simple gesture, a glance that would never be repeated. He intercepted her in a space that he controlled completely. There was no argument, no struggle recorded by security footage or witnesses. The act was merciless in its precision. In those minutes, life was extinguished in a way that would leave no immediate trace of the horror to anyone arriving later. The aftermath, however, was inevitable. The scene left behind in the garage was carefully crafted to mislead. Stillness and order masked violence. It wasn't meant to shock the eyes immediately. It was meant to misdirect investigators, to buy time, to frame the narrative of an outside threat. But even this plan, meticulous as it was, could not erase the digital and physical footprints of premeditation. Every move, every minute, had been recorded in one form or another, quietly documenting the full horror of what had occurred. That morning, what looked ordinary to the world concealed one of the most chillingly deliberate acts of human cruelty. A life ended not in rage or passion, but in calculated, patient premeditation. A reminder that sometimes the greatest horror is not in the noise of violence, but in its quiet execution. To understand this crime, you have to look beyond the act itself, to the mind that orchestrated it. Investigators described him as a master of control, a man whose need for dominance was as subtle as it was absolute. This wasn't just anger, it wasn't jealousy or a fleeting rage. It was a methodical assertion of power, rooted in narcissism and a profound disregard for another person's autonomy. Every move he made, every lie he spun, was designed to assert control over his wife, and over the narrative of her life even after her death. Psychologists call this coercive control. It's a form of intimate partner violence that doesn't rely on visible wounds or public outbursts. Instead, it operates quietly, invisibly, through manipulation, intimidation, and isolation. Victims are often left doubting their own perceptions, questioning their reality, and relying on the abuser for guidance. In this case, the husband's behavior fit perfectly within that framework. Emotional manipulation paired with careful planning, creating a world in which he alone dictated outcomes. The motive, at its core, was power, not wealth, not revenge, not passion, control. Maintaining dominance over his spouse had become an obsession, a psychological compulsion that could not be satisfied by ordinary interactions or negotiations. When control began to slip, even subtly, the only solution in his mind was finality. Death became the ultimate assertion of power, irreversible, undeniable, and entirely within his grasp. This need for control extended beyond the act of murder. It shaped the deception that followed. The false narrative of a stalker, the staged welfare call, the meticulous digital manipulation, all were psychological tools designed to manipulate not just investigators, but the community, friends, and family. In essence, he didn't just kill a person, he tried to kill the truth, bending reality itself to maintain dominance. The chilling reality is that crimes like this often leave little immediate evidence of psychological abuse. The outward appearance can be loving, normal, even mundane, but behind closed doors, a pattern of manipulation, coercion, and fear quietly builds, escalating over time. In this case, it escalated to murder, a horrifying demonstration of how intimate partner violence can reach its deadliest extreme when control becomes obsession. The arrest came quietly, almost anticlimactically, but it was the culmination of months of painstaking investigation. Police arrived early in the morning, armed not with anger but with evidence, digital records, timelines, and forensic reports that left no room for ambiguity. The husband, who had so carefully controlled the narrative for weeks, now faced the weight of incontrovertible proof. For the first time, the calm mask he wore so flawlessly began to crack. Handcuffed and escorted into the car, he maintained a composed exterior, but every gesture, every micro-expression, betrayed the pressure building inside. Neighbors watched, some in disbelief, others in grim understanding. The man who had manipulated an entire community from within his home now found himself completely powerless, stripped of the control he had wielded with such precision. The arrest itself was silent testimony to the meticulous nature of the investigation, proof that even the most calculated puppeteer can be caught when evidence tells the true story. The trial that followed was a tense, emotionally charged spectacle. Courtroom seats were filled with family, friends, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness justice unfold. Prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation and psychological manipulation, laying out timelines, digital footprints, and forensic evidence with methodical clarity. They detailed the husband's efforts to create a false narrative of a stalker, his welfare check call designed to frame himself as the concerned spouse, and the carefully orchestrated crime scene in the garage. Each revelation was more shocking than the last, gradually dismantling the image of a grieving husband and revealing the reality of a calculating murderer. The defense tried to counter with emotion, pleading grief and shock, but the digital trail and physical evidence were relentless. Every claim was challenged by timestamps, location data, and forensic reports. Witness testimonies further eroded his credibility, highlighting discrepancies in his accounts and the inconsistencies in the story he had meticulously crafted. The courtroom became a stage, the evidence a spotlight, exposing the man behind the lies in stark, undeniable detail. Finally, after days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime, the calculated cruelty, and the manipulation that had caused not only the death of a wife, but profound pain for family and community. The courtroom fell silent as the gavel struck, a symbolic end to the control he had once held. In that moment, justice prevailed, not just through punishment, but through the exposure of the truth, leaving no room for further deception. The shockwaves of the crime extended far beyond the courtroom. For the children, the loss was immediate, profound, and lifelong. They had lost a mother, yes, but they had also lost the sense of safety and normalcy that every child deserves. Friends and family stepped in to provide care, but the emotional scars would not fade with time. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair at the table became a reminder of a life stolen and the invisible control that had led to it. At a community level, the case sparked reflection and outrage. How could someone manipulate, isolate, and ultimately murder a loved one without detection? How could the signs of coercive control go unnoticed for so long? Social services and law enforcement faced scrutiny, forced to confront gaps in training and systemic failures that allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. The tragedy became a catalyst for change, prompting new protocols for recognizing patterns of domestic manipulation and improving welfare checks, early interventions, and community awareness. Legally, the case left a lasting imprint. Courts and lawmakers began to take coercive control more seriously, acknowledging it as a form of violence with deadly potential. It became a precedent, a warning, and a guide for future cases where control and manipulation could escalate into physical harm. The husband's conviction sent a clear message: orchestrating fear and control, even behind closed doors, carries consequences. Yet, perhaps the most haunting legacy is less tangible. It is the reminder of how easily trust can be weaponized, how love can be twisted into a tool of control, and how vigilance by communities, authorities, and families is vital to prevent similar tragedies. The aftermath is both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Justice may have been served, but the cost of oversight is written in the lives forever changed by one person's obsession with control. As this story comes to a close, one truth remains chillingly clear. Danger often wears a familiar face. The people we trust most, the ones we love, the ones we live with, can sometimes hide darkness beneath smiles and kindness. This case wasn't about a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was about manipulation, control, and obsession inside a home that seemed ordinary to the outside world. That is what makes it so terrifying. It is a stark reminder to pay attention to warning signs, subtle patterns of control, isolation, and emotional manipulation. Coercive behavior often starts small, a word here, a suggestion there, a decision taken away. Over time, it escalates, eroding trust, independence, and ultimately safety. The tragedy we've explored is not just a tale of murder. It is a cautionary lesson in vigilance, awareness, and the importance of speaking up before fear becomes irreversible. To the audience, let this story resonate beyond curiosity. Learn to recognize the signs, support those who might be trapped, and never ignore your instincts. Life can be stolen not only through violence but through control, deception, and silence. As haunting as this case was, its lasting message is clear. Pay attention, intervene when necessary, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we invite into our homes, because the strings may be invisible until it's too late.